What's up guys, in this video we're going to be talking about deploying Rails to production on your own server. We're going to walk through installing all the dependencies, compiling Ruby, setting up our database, configuring our web server, Nginx, and Passenger, and then finally deploying our code to production using Capistrano. So there's quite a bit we need to cover, but if you want to follow the latest version of this guide, go ahead and go to gorails.com. You can go to guides, deploy Rails, or you can just go to gorails.com/deploy/Ubuntu, and it will redirect you to the latest version that's available. We want to use 18.04 right now because that is the current long-term support release, which will give us security updates for many years in the future, which is better than using the every 6 months release, which doesn't get long-term support. So that is where we're going to start. Take a look at this guide and follow along if you want. In case the instructions change, use the ones on the website, but we're going to walk through at a high level in this video everything you need to know if you just want to wrap your head around how to do this. Before we dive in, I want to mention that I've turned this guide into a product called Hatchbox, where it will go and do all of this in an automated fashion for you, so you don't have to do any of this manually. Plus, it comes with a lot of other features like cluster support, which allows you to set up a load balancer and have redundant web servers, and even move your databases off to their own servers and manage all of that with firewalls, SSL, and all of that taken care of for you. So if you go through this guide and you realize, wow, this is a lot of work, I'd rather have someone do this for me, take a look at hatchbox.io. So we're going to be using DigitalOcean for our hosting provider, but you can use any other provider that gives you Ubuntu and root access. So you could use Amazon EC2, Linode, Vultr, whatever it is, feel free. We're going to be using DigitalOcean because it's super fast and they have a bunch of other cheap options like managed databases that will help us scale out in the future. But for now, we're going to start on a single server and have everything set up there. So we're going to choose Ubuntu 18.04. We want the long-term release or long-term support release of Ubuntu, and that's going to give us security updates for a few years, allowing us to keep our production server a lot more secure. Then we're going to choose a size for the server. Just start small. You can always upgrade this later on just by simply resizing your droplet or your server. We're going to start with a $5 server because we have a very small app. As you have other requirements, or maybe you've got a lot of JavaScript that you need to compile with Webpacker in production, you might want to use a 2 gig or 4 gig server, but we're going to start simple with the $5 one. If you get out of memory errors, just resize your server to the next size. Then you can optionally enable backups if you like, choose the data center that's closest to you and or your customers. And we're going to choose to enable private networking. So in the future, if we want to have this talk to a separate database server inside of our data center, we can go ahead and do that. We can have IPv6 support and monitoring. And optionally, if you want to add your SSH key here, you can go ahead. This is not going to email you a password. It will actually just set up the SSH key for the root user if you add one here. We're going to leave it out so I can show you how to set this up manually. So we're going to have Go Rails Test Production as our host name this whatever you like, and hit create. When this is finished setting up, you're going to get an email with the root password for this server, and you'll be able to see the IP address here on the dashboard. Now that our server is set up, DigitalOcean emailed us with the IP address of the server and our root password, so we can SSH into that server by saying SSH root blank, and you can type in yes to confirm that that is the server you want, and then you're going to have to put in the password they gave you. So I'm going to paste that in, and then immediately they're going to ask you for your current password one more time, and that is going to be the prompt next for setting a brand new password. So go ahead and create your own password. They know that they emailed you the password, so they're going to make you reset it immediately. So we're going to have a new password here, and then we can go ahead and, while we're in here, add user deploy. This is going to create a deploy user. You can give him a password as well, and then you can fill out the rest of these as blanks. And then lastly, we want to add user deploy sudo. It's going to add the deploy user to the sudo group so that the deploy user has access to run commands as root temporarily. So then we can exit the server and we can use a tool called SSH copy ID. You may have to install this with Homebrew, but this is going to take our local SSH key and allow us to copy it over to a user on the server. So here if we say root at 45.55.35.97, this is going to ask for our brand new password that we set on the root user and copy over our local SSH key. Now, if you don't have a local SSH key, the instructions on GitHub will help you set up a key, and you can add that to your machine and then to your GitHub account, and that will get you all set up there. And then we can run SSH copy ID one more time, and we'll say 45.35.97. So we want to copy it over to the deploy user as well. This is going to allow us to SSH into the server without a password now, and it will only ask for our SSH keys password, not our server user password. So now we can log in as deploy to that server and follow the rest of our deployment stuff. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to set up our dependencies that we're going to need. And so the first one we want is nodesource.com's Node.js install. So we're going to grab that, sudo--e bash. Then we're going to, so this will install Node.js as repository for us. Then we're going to add the yarn repository real quickly. This is the 2 lines that we want from that. So paste those in. Then we want to sudo add apt repository ppa Chris Lay /Redis server. This is going to give us the Redis server so that we can use that with action cable if we're going to use that, or maybe for caching. Then we can run, once these have been done, we'll run our sudo apt update just to make sure we have all of those, even though it looked like this just ran it for us. Then we can run sudo apt install git core curl zlib1g-dev build essential libssl dev lib readline dev lib yaml dev lib SQLite 3 dev SQLite 3 lib xml2 dev lib xslt1 dev lib curl for OpenSSL dev software properties common lib ffi dev dir manager GNU-PG app transport https ca certificates Redis server Redis tools Node.js and yarn. And then you'll get a big old prompt like this where you can hit enter to install all of those packages. It's going to download them and just take a minute to install them all. Now I made a couple typos in those package names, so grab and copy and paste that from the guide and you will have no problems with any of those package names. Now that that's done, we're going to install RBEnv, a Ruby version manager, so that we can have an easy way of compiling new Ruby versions on our server. So we're going to say, let's copy the Git repo for RBEnv. We're going to install that to our home directory .rbenv. We're going to git clone https github.com rbenv ruby build.git. That's going to go to rbenv plugins ruby build. And then we're also going to git clone https github.com /rbenv rbenvars.git. And this one's going to also go into rbenv plugins rbenv vars. Now, RBEnv is the version manager, Ruby build is the tools to compile Ruby, and RBEnv vars is going to allow us to create an environment variables file on the server so that every app can have its own database URL, Rails master key, any other environment variables that you would want unique to each app so they're not overlapping, which is super handy. Now, installing these Git repos is step 1, but we need to also modify our bash rc for that. So if we run vim.bashrc ~bashrc, down here at the bottom, we can type path equals home /.rbn bin path. And this is going to then add RBM to our path, but we also want to make sure that we have home RBM plugins Ruby build /bin in there as well. So we add that. And then we want to add a line called eval and RBM init hyphen space init space hyphen. And this is going to evaluate the RBM init script so that everything is available for us. Now, if we close this and we say exec $shell, so reload our shell, and we should be able to type RBM now and see that that command works. And we can type RBM install and our Ruby version. So currently the latest version of Ruby that we want to use to deploy our app is 2.6.1. So we're going to go ahead and install that, but feel free to change that with whatever Ruby version number you want to install. This will go ahead and download the source code for Ruby and then compile it for your server. It's going to take a while, especially on a $5 server. So give it a minute while it installs and we'll be good to go. Feel free to also install any other Ruby versions that you might want. So you can have 2 Ruby versions or 3 or 4 if you have, say, 2 or 3 or 4 apps on your server that might be wanting to use different ones. You can install multiple ones on your server using RBM, which can come in super handy. Now that we have Ruby installed, we can run RBM global 2.6.1 to set the global Ruby version. You can run ruby-v to see that output. Now we want to install bundler. This is going to install the latest bundler, and 2.0 recently came out. If you have an application that's not using that, you can also gem install bundler. v 1.17.3 is the latest version of bundler 1.x. And that will just be useful in case you happen to have an application that needs the older bundler. Next up, we want to install Nginx and Passenger. So we're going to run sudo apt key adv key server hkp key server.ubuntu.com:80 receive keys. And the key we want is 561F9B9CAC 40B2F7. That should be the one for Passenger. And we'll download that key. And here we can see the Fusion automated software signing key, which is Fusion Passenger. They're the guys that make Passenger. And we can run sudo shc echo deb https ossbinaries.fusionpassenger.com apt passenger bionic main to write that into etsy apt sources.list.d/passenger.list, and that's going to write that repository out. We can sudo apt update to update that new repository in our list. Then sudo apt install -y nginx extras and lib nginx mod http passenger. That's going to install Passenger and Nginx along with all the extra functionality that you can get. So at the very end of this, it's going to trigger an Nginx reload, which if you open up your IP address in the browser, you should see the welcome to Nginx site. And that is one thing we want to remove. But first, before we do that, we want to check and see if a file exists or not. And so we're going to say etc nginx modules enabled 50 mod http passenger.conf, and then sudo ln-s user share nginx modules available mod http passenger.load. We're going to symlink that to etc nginx modules enabled 50 mod http passenger.conf, and then we're going to say sudo vim etc nginx conf.d mod HTTP passenger. And then we're going to change the passenger Ruby line to point to our RBM installation. So home deploy.rbm shims Ruby. And we're going to save that file and quit. That's going to tell passenger where to find Ruby and make sure it uses the correct Ruby version for us. And then we want to remove the Etsy Nginx sites enabled default file. We want to get rid of that default page that we see here, and we're going to add our own site to that folder. So we're going to open up a file in there, sites enabled, and you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call my app to-do list, so I'm going to name it to-do list as the file name. And inside here, we want to create a server block with our configuration. So we want to listen on port 80, and we also want to listen on : in square brackets, :80, and that will be IPv6 port 80. Then we're going to have our server name as just an underscore. This underscore will make it so that it doesn't care what domain comes in, it will serve that up. And if you want, you can say domain.com or whatever your domain is if you want to have multiple sites on the same server. Nginx just needs to know the domain name so it can separate out the requests to the correct server. Since we only have one, we're just going to use an underscore and that'll work just fine. Then we want to give it a root, and this is going to be where our code will be deployed to in the future, so we want to be careful with this and make sure we have the name right. So I'm going to name everything to-do list so that we have that set up correctly, and we want to point it to the current/public folder, and then we can say passenger enabled on. This is going to set it up by default to use production mode. But we can also set passenger app env to production or staging. And that's going to set your Rails env and your rack env environment variables accordingly to staging or production. Then we're going to add a location for cable. So this will set up our action cable stuff. And we'll say passenger app group name, to-do list underscore WebSocket. And passenger force max concurrent requests per process to 0. And then we can have client max body size is saying 100 megabytes. So that will allow file uploads up to 100 megabytes in size. Feel free to change that for whatever makes the most sense for your app. And then we're going to say assets packs. We want these to be the maximum expiration and gzip static on so that our assets and JavaScript packs are set with the proper expirations. Then we can run sudo service nginx reload to go ahead and reload those configuration files that we just changed. And now we're going to need to create a database. So we're going to be using Postgres for this. And we'll say sudo apt install PostgreSQL, PostgreSQL contrib, and libpq dev. That's going to allow us to install the Postgres server, as well as libpq is going to allow us to compile the PG gem so that we can connect to Postgres through Ruby. Then once we're done with this is going to set up our little cluster here for the database. And then we can sudo su the Postgres Linux user. This Linux user has access to do a create user. So we'll say pw prompt. We're going to call our database user deploy, just like our Linux user, and we're going to give this a password. I'm just going to call it password to keep it simple, and that's going to create a Postgres user called deploy then. This will make sure our applications have certain permissions to interact with their database, but not the entire Postgres cluster and any other databases you might have in there. So you might want to create a separate user for every application, just like Heroku does. So if one application gets attacked, the other Postgres databases should be safe. So we're also going to say create DB with -O, that's not a 0. And we're going to give the deploy user as the owner, and we'll call our database like to-do list production. And if we create the database, then we can exit out of our Postgres user. So now to test this out, we can use the PSQL command. We'll do -U, the deploy user, capital W means password prompt, and we're going to have to use 127.0.0.1 instead of localhost to connect, and we want to use to-do list production as our database name. And if we run that, we should get prompted for our deploy user's password for the database, and we should be able to log in to SQL, and we can. So that's great. That means that when we connect later on to our database, we just need to fill out those same details in our database URL environment variable. The same sort of steps are listed on the guide for MySQL if you want to use that instead. It's a little bit different in the commands you need to run to set up a database, but it's very simple and all listed out there. Now we're going to hop into our code base and add our Capistrano configs. So first things first, you want to go to your gem file, and at the bottom we're going to add a couple gems for Capistrano. First things first, we're going to add the latest Capistrano gem, which in my case is 3.11. You can go look up the latest version if you would like, or for sure these versions will work, but you might want to use a newer version if you want. Then we're going to add Capistrano Rails, Capistrano Passenger, and Passenger is 0.2.0, and gem Capistrano RBEnv. And then this one is 2.1 and greater than or equal to 2.1.4. Then we'll go back, we'll run bundle to install it on our local machine. And you'll notice here that I'm using Ruby 2.5.3 for this. I want to show you what will happen if you get an error during deployment when you basically upload code and Passenger doesn't know how to start it. I want to show you how to debug those issues when you deploy things to production. So I'm going to show you a thing that fails so that we can go and fix it. Then we want to run, after installing those Capistrano gems, we want to run cap install stages equals production. You could also add in staging here if you like, and you can have those two to deploy to staging or production, but we're just going to stick with production. What this will do is create a cap file, a config deploy.rb and config deploy production, and potentially if you added staging, config deploy staging.rb. Now the three of these files we need to modify. Each one has a little bit different purpose, so we're going to go into our cap file. This is where we kind of define our dependencies that we need, and so in this case we're going to uncomment require Capistrano RBEnv, Capistrano Passenger, and we want Capistrano Rails, but we're going to just do our own line here. So let's just do this, Capistrano Rails, because it's going to basically do bundler, assets, and migrations. That's what Capistrano Rails will do, but it's just one command. Then at the bottom, we want to set RBEnv type to user and set RBEnv Ruby to the version of Ruby we want to use on the server. So this is important. That will make sure that it chooses the correct version of Ruby when you were doing your deployments. Then we can go into our config and deploy.rb file. This is where we're going to set our application name. So here we want to call it to-do list. This needs to match the folder that we defined in our Nginx config. And we're also going to modify set deploy to the same thing. So here we're going to say home/deploy/ and we can call fetch application to basically grab this to-do list value and insert it into the string for us. You could also hard code it, but it's a little bit easier if you set this up like so. So then I'm going to change my repo URL to github.com/exit3/to-do list, which is where my code is living. Then we want to uncomment the linked directories. Now we want to change this just slightly. We want to add in here before public system vendor bundle and .bundle, and then at the end we want to add public uploads, I believe. Uploads, and that will take care of any file uploads that you might do to local disk. That would allow you to handle active storage and carrier wave and paperclip for their whatever folder names they are. This is also going to take the logs and the PIDs and any temp stuff and keep them all in a single folder no matter how many times you deploy it, because Capistrano in production will create multiple folders every time that you make a deployment. It creates a new folder, and then there's a current symlink which will point to the current version folder. So whenever you make a deploy and it's successful, the current symlink changes to the new folder, and then your application gets restarted so that it uses your new code. That makes it really easy to roll back, so you can have that current symlink point to the old folder, and then you're good to go on a rollback. Last thing we're going to do is keep releases to 5. We're only going to keep 5 releases so we don't have too much stuff on our server. If you have a large Git repo or something like that, this will keep that disk usage down low. Then the last thing we need to modify for Capistrano is we go into config deploy production.rb and add a line for the server, paste in your IP address, user will be deploy, and the roles the server is going to run are app, DB, and web. So that's going to make sure that everything is run correctly. Your migrations will run, your asset compilations will run, and all that good stuff. Then we can go to our server and make a directory for our application. So we, inside of our home directory, want to make that to-do list folder. So that to-do list folder is the same as doing, it's the exact same thing as doing home/deploy/to-do list. That's where our code's going to live, but we don't have anything in there yet. What we do want to do is create a to-do list.rbn vars file. Now, what's special about this is these are the environment variables we can define just for this application. And the main one we're concerned about is the database URL. We're going to set this equal to PostgreSQL://deploy our password. In my case, I just named it password. And then 127001/to-do list. And I believe I called mine to-do list production as the database name. So that's the database that you're going to use, their username, their password, the host, and your database name. So we can save that. If you're using Rails 5.2, also add your Rails master key in here so the credentials can be decrypted. You might need to do that for any other variables that you want for production, your Stripe keys, your secret key base. And so secret key base would look something like this. Secret key base, you can go into your application, say bundle Rails secret or bundle exec Rails secret. This is going to generate a secret key base that you can go ahead and set up for all of your sessions in production. All of your sessions will be signed with that key. So that will be that for what we need to do on the server, and we can go back to our application now and run cap production deploy. Now, this is going to do quite a bit of different things, but namely, the important things here is it's creating the folders, it's cloning our Git repository onto the server, and then it's running bundle install. So you can see the exact commands here that it's running in orange. The sections of things it's working on is linking directories, setting the current revision, creating a release, and all that stuff. And so this is now going to take a minute while it installs all of our gems for the very first time. Then next time, once this has installed all our gems, it will be much quicker. It will only need to install any gems that have changed since your last deployment. This may take a while, and it's going to also run your database migrations and compile your assets. So I will see you back in just a second. Hooray! Our application has been deployed for the very first time, everything completed, but don't pat yourself on the back just yet. If we open up this in the browser, Passenger is going to tell us that it's broken. Now, the way to debug this, if you get this specific passenger error, is you can go into your server and type sudo less var log nginx error.log and press, after typing in your password, type Shift G to go down to the very bottom of the file and look for the error. what we see here is the app output says RBM said version 2.5.3 is not installed. And so that's our error. Our application isn't able to start whenever you see this passenger error. The fix for that is pretty simple. We can edit our .ruby version file and make it match the version that we have on the server. So then we're going to say git status. We want to add .ruby version in this commit, and we'll say update Ruby version. Yes, git commit -m update Ruby version. We'll push that up to Git, and we'll run cap production deploy to go ahead and run the new deployment with our code that's fresh up on GitHub. This time it ran a lot faster, and if we go back to our browser, we can refresh the page and we see that our application is now running. Now, if you see any Rails errors, that you get the default Rails 500 error page, you can go to your server and type less, the name of your app in your home directory, so to-do list, current /log/production.rb and or .log, and then Shift G to go down to the very bottom of the file, and you can see those logs. You can also do tail-f to-do list current /log production.log to keep those running in a terminal. So if you refresh the page, you'll see that lines get added to this automatically. So there you have it. We've set up our own server in production. We've configured everything. We've installed Ruby, and we've made it easy for us to go ahead and add new Ruby versions on the server and then change our .ruby version file and cap file to go and make our next Capistrano deployment use that in production. We've also made it really easy to add environment variables on the server, and the next steps are to add things like hourly database backups, SSL, log rotations, and a few other things. So I'll leave links to those other guides in the notes below, but pat yourself on the back if you've made it this far. And if you have any questions or issues, let us know in the comments below and we'll take a look. And if you've made it this far and found yourself thinking, boy, I wish someone else would take care of this for me, take a look at hatchbox.io. We'll go ahead and configure your servers for you and add a bunch of other features like clusters and load balancer support, as well as all of those little details like log rotation already set up for you, so you don't have to worry about any of those configuration changes. Even between versions of Ubuntu, we keep track of that and all of the various differences between them, so you don't have to worry about it. So if you're interested, take a look at hatchbox.io.